Hello everybody, my name is Michael and I hope you're having a wonderful day. And in this video series, I will be documenting my progress as I complete the Harvard Online CS50P course offered through EDX. Feel free to follow along and complete the course with me. The notes on the right side of my screen can be found in the description below. Let's begin.
All right, this is CS50's Introduction to Programming with Python. My name is David Malin, and this is our week on functions and variables. But odds are many of you, most of you, have never actually programmed before, so let's start by doing just that. Let me go ahead here and open up my computer, and on it a program called Visual Studio Code, or VS Code, which is just a very popular program nowadays for actually writing code. Now, you don't have to write code using this particular tool. In fact, all we need at the end of the day is a so-called text editor, a program for writing text. And heck, if you really want, you could even use something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word. You'd have to save it in the right format. But really, at the end of the day, all you need is a program for writing text, because that's what code is, text. Now, within this particular program, I'm going to have the ability to create one or more files via this top portion of the screen. And I'm going to do so by diving right in and doing this at the bottom of my screen. At the bottom of my screen is a so-called terminal window. And this is a command line interface, or CLI, interface to the underlying computer, be it your Mac or your PC or even some server in the cloud. And what I'm going to do here is literally write code and then the name of the file that I want to code, for instance, hello.py. As we'll soon see, any program that you write in Python generally has a file name that ends in .py to indicate to the computer that it's indeed a program written in Python. Now, you'll see here at the top of my screen, I have a blinking cursor, a line 1, which is where the very first line of my code is going to go, and then just a tab that reminds me of the name of this file, hello.py. And without even knowing much Python, I'm going to write my very first program here as follows. Print, open parenthesis, quote, hello, comma, world, close quote, and close parenthesis. And you'll see that at my keyboard, some of my thoughts were finished for me. I only had to type one parenthesis, and the other one automatically appeared. And that's just a feature that we'll see of tools like this tool here. Now, even if you've never programmed before, odds are you can guess, infer what this simple program is going to do. And it's only one line. Print, open parenthesis, quote, hello world, close quote, close parenthesis. Indeed, when I run this program, ultimately, it's just going to say hello to the world. And in fact, this is a very famous, perhaps the most canonical program that you can write as your very first program in Python or any other language. And so that's what I've done here. But on my Mac, my PC, even my phone, I'm generally in the habit, like you, of running programs by double-clicking an icon or just tapping on the screen. But I see no such icons here. And in fact, that's because my interface to at least my current Mac or PC or some server in the cloud is, again, only a CLI, command line interface, which even though it might feel like it's a step back from the menus and buttons and icons that you and I take for granted every day, you'll find, we think, that it's ultimately a much more powerful interface and incredibly popular to use among programmers in the real world. So to run this program, I'm going to have to use a command. And I'm going to move my cursor back down to the bottom of the screen here, where previously I already ran one command, the command code, which has the effect of opening VS Code in my computer. And then I passed in the name of the file that I wanted to code up. Now I have a chance to type a second command, and you'll see I see a second $sign. Now, the $sign here doesn't indicate any kind of currency or money. It just is the symbol that's generally used to indicate your prompt, where the command line interface wants you to put those commands. Now, the command I can run here is going to be this. I'm going to run Python of hello.py. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that when I actually write code in a language like Python, it's, of course, stored in that file, hello.py. But I need to interpret the code top to bottom, left to right, so that the computer knows what to do. Indeed, at the end of the day, even if you don't really know much about computers, you've probably heard that computers only understand zeros and one, the so-called binary system. Well, if that's the case, then something that says print and parenthesis and quote unquote hello world is not surely zeros and ones. We have to somehow translate it into the zeros and ones that the computer understands. Now, fortunately, so long as you've installed such a program in advance, there's a program as well as a language called Python. So Python is not only a language in which we're going to write code, it's also a program, otherwise known as an interpreter, that you install for free on your own Mac or PC or some server in the cloud. And you can then run that program, that interpreter, passing to it as input the name of your file, like mine here, hello.py. And then that program, that interpreter, will handle the process of reading it top to bottom, left to right, and translating it effectively into those zeros and ones that the computer can understand. So let's do just that. Let me go back to VS Code here. I already typed out Python of hello.py, but I didn't yet hit enter. And that's what's now going to kick off this command. And hopefully, if I didn't mess any of this up, I should see my very first program's output to the screen. And voila, hello world. So if you too have typed exactly that same code and have executed exactly that same command, you will have written your very first program, in this case, in Python. Well, now let's take a step back and consider what is it that we actually just did, and what is it we're looking here on the screen. Well, first and foremost, in most any programming language, you tend to have access to what are called functions. A function is like an action or a verb that lets you do something in the program. And generally speaking, any language comes with some predetermined set of functions, some very basic actions or verbs that the computer will already know how to do for you, that the language really will know how to do for you. And you, the programmer, the human, can use those functions at will to get the computer to do those things. Now, the program in question here, hello.py, is using one function. And you can perhaps guess what it is. That function is, of course, going to be this function print. And that print function, of course, doesn't print some preordained string of text. That is to say, it prints whatever it is you want it to print. And here, too, do we have another piece of terminology in the world of programming, namely arguments. An argument is an input to a function that somehow influences its behavior. The people who invented Python, of course, didn't necessarily know what it is you and I are going to want to print to the screen. So they designed this print function using these parentheses with the ability to take as input some string of text, be it in English or any other human language, that is what you want this function ultimately to print onto the screen. And what is it that the program's ultimately doing on the screen? Well, it's printing, of course. It's showing us hello world on the screen. And that's generally in programming known as a side effect. It can be visual, it can be audio. In this case, it's something that appears on the screen. And functions, therefore, can indeed have these side effects. One of the things they can do as this verb or action is to display on the screen as a side effect something like those words that we wanted, hello world. So that's my first program. And, you know, I'm feeling pretty good. Everything worked as planned. I didn't make any mistakes. But honestly, when you're learning how to program, and even once you've learned how to program years later, you're going to make mistakes. And those mistakes, of course, are referred to a term you might already know, which is that of a bug. A bug is a mistake in a program. And they can take so many forms. And take comfort, perhaps, in knowing that over the coming weeks, you're going to make so many mistakes. You're going to have so many bugs in your code, just like I did, and just as I still do. And those bugs themselves are just mistakes that are problems for you to solve. And over the weeks to come, we're going to give you a lot of tools, both mental and technical, via which you can solve those problems. But just don't get discouraged if when writing your program for the first time, it doesn't even work that first time. It will, with time, with practice, and with experience. So let me deliberately now make a mistake that there was a non-zero chance I might have done accidentally already, but I got lucky. Let me go ahead and just suppose I forgot to include something like the closing parenthesis at the end of this line of code. You know, the code is almost correct. It's like 99% of the way there. But now that I've pointed it out, it's pretty obvious that it's missing that closed parenthesis. But even little, seemingly minor details like that you and I as humans wouldn't really care about. And if you're sending an email or a text message, whatever, it's just a typo. It's not that big a deal. It is going to be a big deal to the computer. A computer is going to take you literally, and if you don't finish your thought in the way the language expects, it's not going to necessarily run at all. So let's do this. I'm going to go ahead here and clear my screen down at the bottom, just so I can start fresh. And I'm going to go ahead and run this version of my program after having made that change by deleting the parenthesis. I'm going to go ahead and type Python again of hello.py. And this time when I hit enter, I'm hoping I'm going to see hello world, but here we have an error on the screen, a so-called syntax error, which refers to my having made a mistake at my keyboard. And this one, fortunately, is pretty straightforward. It indeed says that this open parenthesis was never closed. And so that's probably pretty intuitive now what I need to do. I need, of course, to close it. Unfortunately, sometimes the error messages we'll see in the coming weeks are not going to be nearly that user-friendly. But there, too, again, with experience, with practice, will you get better at debugging such programs. Let me now make sure that I indeed fixed it correctly. Let me go ahead and run now hello.py and hit enter. And voila, we're back in business. Allow me to forge ahead here, but please feel free to continue asking questions along the way, if only via the chat. And let's consider now how we might go about improving this program. Let's go about improving this program to make it a little more interactive and not just assume that everyone is going to want to be greeted more generically as hello world. Let's see if I can't get this program to say something like hello David or hello Jeremiah or hello Horatio or whatever the actual user's name is. Well, to do this, I'm going to go back up to hello.py, and I'm going to add another line of code at the very top that simply says, for instance, what's your name, quote unquote, with an extra space at the end. So I'm printing to the user, asking them a question for some input. But now I need another function to actually get input from the user. And perfectly enough, Python comes with a function named input. So here I'm going to go ahead and call a function input open paren, close paren. And that's going to prompt the user with just a blinking cursor waiting for them to type something in. Now, it turns out if I read the documentation for the input function, it actually takes an argument itself. I don't need to use print separately and then prompt the user for input. So I can actually simplify this code before we even use it. I'm going to go ahead here and take that same string from print, put it as an argument to the input function, and get rid of the print altogether. And in fact, that print would have added a new line anyway. So now I've just got a prompt where the user's cursor is going to end up blinking at the end of the line, asking them, what's your name? In my terminal window, I'm going to run Python of hello.py, enter. OK, we're making progress. It seems that this new function input is indeed prompting me, the human, for input. So I'm going to type in my name, David, and hit enter. Unfortunately, it doesn't really do anything with my name. It just outputs it immediately. All right, well, I could fix this, right? I could go up to line 2, and I could change world to David. And then back in my terminal window here, I can do Python of hello.py, enter. What's your name? David, enter. And there we go. All right, now I'm up and running. Now my program is working as intended. Of course, this isn't really working as intended here. Let me go ahead and try pretending to be my colleague Carter here. Well, Carter's name is this. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'll see, of course, hello Carter. Well, obviously not, because I've hard-coded, so to speak. I've written literally my name inside of the string. So we need some way now of actually getting back what the user's input is and doing something with it ultimately. And for this, we're going to leverage another feature of programming, specifically a feature of some functions, which is that they can have return values as well. If you think of input as being, again, this action, this verb, you can actually personify it as maybe a person, like a friend of yours that you've asked a question of. And you've asked your friend to go get input from someone else. Go ask that person their name. And if your friend comes back knowing that person's name, well, wouldn't it be nice if they handed that name back to you? That's kind of what we need metaphorically the function to do, is get the user's input and then hand it back to me so that I, the programmer, can do something with it. But if it's going to be handed back to me, I kind of want to put it somewhere so that I can then print it back on the screen. I need to do the equivalent of take out like a piece of paper or a Post-it note, write down on this piece of paper what it is the human has said so that I can then feed it into as input that print function. And to do that, we're going to need one more feature of programming, namely variables. And odds are most everyone's familiar with variables from math class way back when, x and y and z and the like. Well, programming has that same capability, this ability to create a variable, in this case in the computer's memory, not just on a piece of paper, and that variable can store a value. A number, some text, even an image or video or more. A variable is just a container for some variable. A variable is just a container for some value inside of a computer or inside of your own program. So how do I go about expressing myself in this way? Well, I think what I'm going to do is introduce a variable that's a little more interestingly named than x or y. I could just say this, x equals input. But I'm going to use a better name than a typical mathematical variable here. And I'm going to literally call my variable name. Why? Well, in programming, because I have a whole keyboard in front of me, I can use more descriptive terms to describe what it is I'm writing. And now, though, there's an opportunity to consider a specific piece of syntax. We've seen parentheses. We've seen quotes, all of which are necessary when passing inputs to a function. But this equal sign here that's in between input on the right and name on the left is actually important. And it's technically not an equal sign per se. It doesn't mean equality as much as it means assignment. So in Python and many programming languages, a single equal sign is the assignment operator. And what that means specifically is that you want to assign from right to left whatever the user's input is.
Operator.
So the equal sign copies from the right to the left whatever the return value of the function on the right is. So again, the input function clearly gets input from the user. That's why I was able to type my name or Carter's. But it also sort of behind the scenes hands that value, that return value, back to me, the programmer. And if I use an equal sign and a variable, no matter what I call it, I can store that input in that variable so as to reuse it later. So now sitting in the computer's memory somewhere is a container containing David, quote unquote, or Carter, quote unquote, or whatever the human has typed in. But here it's easy to make a mistake. Suppose I decide to try to print that name. And so I kind of, on a hunch, type in this, hello, comma, name, just kind of plugging in the name of the variable. Well, let me go ahead here and run Python of hello.py and hit enter. That's going to prompt me for my name. And let me type in my name, D-A-V-I-D, but I haven't hit enter yet. And perhaps via the chat, what's going to happen here when I now hit enter? I'm hoping it says, hello, David. I'd be OK if it says, hello, world.
So he's assigning the name variable using this equal sign operator, which assigns the variable itself to the value of this input function. What is your name? So we put Michael for my name, print hello name. Well, I don't think this is really going to work because name isn't being directly called to because it's within the bounds of the print function quotations, which is returning, literally the word name as from what I'm interpreting.
But I don't want it to say what it's actually going to say. And yep, what we're seeing in the chat is, well, it's probably going to say literally hello, comma, name. So that's not quite right. So we need another way of printing out the value inside of that variable rather than just this word name. Well, let me try this in a couple of different ways. Let me try this as follows. Let me go ahead and maybe undo this because I've gotten pretty good already at saying hello. So let's draw that line in the sand and just say, all right, let's at least get hello, comma, out the door. Let's now print name. And just on a hunch, I'm going to try this. I'm going to use print again, because you can use these functions as many times as you need. And I'm going to pass to the print function, the variable called name. But notice, I'm being a little clever now. I'm not putting it in double quotes, because we've seen already that double quotes means literally print out N-A-M-E. I'm getting rid of the quotes this time in hopes that now by passing the variable called name to the function called print, it will, in fact, go about printing the contents of that variable, that is, its so-called value. All right, let's go ahead and do this here. Python of hello.py, enter. What's your name? David. And now, crossing my fingers still, I see hello, comma, David. All right, so it's not the best program. I'm kind of cutting some corners here, so to speak. I'm saying hello, David, on two separate lines. So it's not as elegant, it's not as pretty, it's not as grammatically appropriate in English as just saying it all in one breath on one line. But at least I've solved the problem, just not very well yet. But let me take a step back.
So what's currently happening is he's on line 2 printing hello, comma, literally H-E-L-O, comma, because it's engulfed in its quotes in the print function. And then on line 3, he's printing the name variable from the input. So Python is literally interpreting line by line. Hello, comma, David. We need to somehow, I'm sure he's going to tell us, get hello, comma, David to be within the same line.
Now, and perhaps introduce a couple of other concepts with which we should be familiar, which is as our programs get longer and they're no longer just one line or two or even three, eventually our programs are going to become dozens of lines, maybe even hundreds of lines long. Let's set the stage for success moving forward.
Comments.
It turns out that Python and a lot of programming languages also support something called comments. Comments are notes to yourself in your code. And you include comments by way of a special symbol. In Python, it's going to be the hash symbol, typically. And that allows you to write the equivalent of a note to yourself, but in a way that's not going to break your code. The computer actually ignores your comments. It's just there for you. It's just there for your teacher. It's just there for your colleague with whom you're sharing ultimately that code. So if I go back to VS Code here, and I just want to add some comments to this program to explain to my teacher, to myself, to my colleagues what this program is doing, well, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go at the very top of my program. And on line 1 now, I'm going to move that original line of code down a bit. I'm going to add a hash. And I'm going to say something like this, ask user for their name. Now, I don't have to use that language. I don't have to use that text. I could use any human language whatsoever. It doesn't have to be English. But I'm going to now, below that, just say something like this, say hello to user. And you'll notice that VS Code by default is kind of graying out my comments. They're no longer blue. There's no red. There's no color in them. And that's just because they're notes to myself, and the computer ultimately is going to ignore them. But what we have now is 2 comments, ask user for their name, and then a second comment, say hello to user. And I've just kind of commented each chunk of code, like each line or lines plural of code that are doing something noteworthy. Why? Well, tomorrow morning when I wake up, having slept for quite some time, forgotten what it is I did the previous day, it's convenient with comments to just see in English or your own human language what it is this program is doing, so that you don't have to read the code itself. And better yet, if there's maybe a mistake down the road, you can read what your intention was, and then you can look at the code and figure out if your code's now doing what you intended. So this isn't really necessary for a program this small. It's pretty obvious with just 1 or 2 or 3 lines what the program's doing. It's just as fast to read the code than the comments. But getting into this habit is generally a good thing, to comment your code every 1 or few lines so as to remind yourself and others what it is your intent and your code is doing. What's nice about comments, too, is this. Comments can also serve to be sort of a to-do list for yourself. There's this notion in programming of pseudocode. Pseudocode isn't a formal thing. It's not one specific language. It's just using English or your own human language to express your thoughts succinctly, methodically, algorithmically, so to speak. But pseudocode, therefore, because it's not Python and it's not necessarily English, it just kind of allows you to outline your program even in advance. So for instance, if I wasn't sure today how I wanted to go about writing this program, but I did know what I want to do, I could have started today by just writing this in hello.py. No code. I could have written just a couple of comments to myself. Step 1, ask user for their name. Step 2, say hello to user. Then, once I've outlined my program in pseudocode, then I can go in there and say, all right, how do I ask the user for their name? Well, I can do input, quote unquote, what's your name, question mark. And then on the left here, I can maybe put a variable and assign it to that. OK, how do I say hello to the user? Well, I know I can use print to say things on the screen. Let me say hello, comma. And let me now print the person's name. So again, pseudocode is a nice way of structuring your to-do list, especially if you have no idea how to write the code, because it breaks a bigger program down into small, bite-sized tasks.
All right, so with that break, we learned about return values. Obviously, we're given back the value to feed elsewhere, he said. Not sure what that means yet. We haven't really returned any value. I mean, the input returns a value, I guess. The user's value is returned through and it's put into a variable. It's probably what he was alluding to. What else did we learn? We were given pseudocode comments begin with a hashtag and they're ignored by the program and will not be read. And then the pseudocode, using your own language to express your thoughts or break down your program into steps or a to-do list. So, like with his example on the screen, he has it broken down as step 1, ask the user for their name. Step 2, say hello to user. So just breaking things down into smaller steps to make things easier on the programmer, because I'm sure it gets confusing as your program gets larger and larger. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for part 1 of this lecture. Stay tuned for part 2.